strategically located on the border with India and other nations. It's rich in natural resources, including water. In fact, it's called the third pole, the plateau, because it's the third largest repository of snow and ice outside the Arctic and Antarctic. And today, in fact, is warming on average more than twice as fast as the rest of the world, and the source of almost all of Asia's rivers. China's so-called peaceful liberation of Tibet was, in fact, a military invasion. In October 1950, 40,000 troops from the People's Liberation Army crossed into central Tibet, swamping the small Tibetan army. And an independent country the size of Western Europe became an occupied territory. In the early years, the Dalai Lama attempted to work with Chairman Mao, but persecution steadily increased, and Tibetan resistance reached a breaking point in March 1959, when popular protests erupted in Lhasa. And when China began shelling the city, the Dalai Lama was forced to escape into exile. Tens of thousands of Tibetans followed him, and Chinese radio reported that 87,000 Tibetans had been killed as a result of that 10th March uprising. And this is a date that's commemorated annually every year by the Tibetan diaspora, about which Mandy will say a bit more later. So fast forward to the present day, the Dalai Lama has lived in exile in northern India for approaching 60 years. He's created a democratic system of governance for the Tibetan diaspora, and in the past 6 years has completely devolved his political authority to a democratically elected leader. Here's Sikyong Lobsang Sangye, who's the head of the Central Tibetan Administration. And over successive decades, China tightened its grip, and despite repressive policies, and even in spite of the odd period of relative liberalism, the Tibetan people have refused to accept the loss of their nation. This is the Tibetan snowline flag, which is often used as a symbol of resistance. And Tibetans courageously assert their distinct identity, which China's policies have placed under extreme pressure. Their language, Buddhist traditions, even their ancient ways of life, such as that of the nomadic people of the Tibetan Plateau, who are currently being compelled in their hundreds of thousands to adopt dramatically different lives in what China calls new socialist villages, places where alcoholism and domestic abuse and suicides are on the rise. In the face of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances, lack of freedom of association, lack of freedom of expression, and despite the extreme risks of torture and the risk of custody, and these are all human rights abuses that the United Human Rights Mechanisms have repeatedly identified, Tibetans in Tibet have continued to resist China's rule. And this morning, Decem and Kunsang are going to talk a bit more about some of the sort of more creative forms of Tibetan resistance. But mass protest has been a regular feature over the decades, especially in the late 1980s and again since 2008. So journalists are not permitted to travel to Tibet independently. And this photo shows monks from Labrang Monastery staging a very courageous protest during a rare state-organised media trip to Tibet. And here are students in Rokong in northern Tibet protesting about official plans to restrict teaching in the Tibetan language. But in recent years, protest has taken a much more tragic turn, with almost 150 Tibetans from all walks of life setting fire to their bodies, calling for freedom and for the Dalai Lama to be able to return home. And most of these have died, including 17-year-old nun Sangye Dolma. The message on her hand here reads, "Tibet is an independent nation," and a poem that she wrote before she died is headed, "Beloved children of the snowline, sons and daughters of the land of snows, warriors of the snow mountain, don't forget you are Tibetans." And I'm going to, on that rather sad note, pass to Decem, who's going to talk about Tibetan cultural resistance.
Thank you. So can everyone hear me? My name is Decem. Thanks, Ali, for the intro and for the fantastic sort of background to Tibet. I run a website which is called High Peaks Pure Earth, and it's sort of best described as a translations project. Basically, what my website does is that it monitors blogs and online writings from Tibet, whether they're in Tibetan or Chinese, and translates them into English. Because if you're interested in Tibet and you want to know what's happening and what people inside Tibet, inside China, are thinking, saying, discussing, writing about, if you don't know Chinese and if you don't know Tibetan, then it's pretty much a very inaccessible world. So the idea behind the website is to make those writings and these cultural expressions accessible. So the main person really that I wanted to introduce to you was this lady here who's called Wose. And she's a writer, a poet, a blogger, and she's one of the main cultural figures inside Tibet, inside China today, who is openly defiant and critical of the government. So she's a very well-known and high-profile dissident. She has a blog which is extremely important source of information for what's happening inside Tibet. And the sort of how the project started, the translations project, is that in 2008 there was a massive uprising in Tibet, like Ali mentioned, and there were protests all over and a complete information blackout, and a lot of people trusted Wose as someone to go to get their stories and to get news out to the outside world. So to bypass sort of information blocks, and you can't go to the media and you can't go to people, you have to really go to people that you trust. And at that time, her blog was one of the main sources of information, but it was all in Chinese. Her background is that she was born at the height of the Cultural Revolution and sort of socialized and assimilated into a very Chinese surrounding because her father was quite high up in the People's Liberation Army. So even though they were a Tibetan family, she never learned Tibetan at school. And so she grew up learning Chinese, almost having Chinese as a mother tongue, and only sort of really relearning to speak it a lot later. So her blog is in Chinese. So on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you see her blog in Chinese, and then next to that is the translation on High Peaks Pure Earth. This video is Wose reading one of her poems. It's very short, it's just 1 minute, but it's a poem that she wrote in 2000 on March the 10th, which is a really symbolic date because that's the date of the national uprising against the Chinese occupying forces, and after that the Dalai Lama had to flee into exile. So this poem is really, really in a sort of poetic, beautiful way, describing her feelings towards the Dalai Lama even back in 2000 when she was beginning to have sort of an eye-opening moment into Tibet's history and what really happened in the past. So if we could just play the video for the 1 minute.
于2000年3月10日的拉萨，回家，在一个寒冷冬天，风暴卷走了经幡。我的神鹰啊，它被魔鬼所伤，它惊飞的样子，我想起来就会流泪。许多年已经过去，大地弥漫着香火，我的神鹰啊。 它在哪里养伤？它疼痛的样子，我想起来就会流泪。Om Mani Padme Hum，Om Mani Padme Hum， 回家吧，让我的神鹰回家吧，回家吧，让我们的神鹰回家吧。
So that poem was written in Chinese, like I said, on a very symbolic day. And after she wrote this poem and after she published her first book of poetry, the Chinese government officials were very interested in her work, and they actually made her attend political re-education classes, saying that there were errors in her ways of thinking, and she basically lost her job. She lost all the sort of security she had in Tibet, and she basically ended up going to live in Beijing without any benefits or any security, and sort of living this sort of independent life. She calls it a kind of internal exile because she doesn't have a passport. She's not allowed to travel to foreign countries, so she's kind of just trapped in this place, and she can only show her defiance through blogging and through social media. She has a very active Twitter account, Facebook account, Instagram account, but she can only access these through VPNs. So in China, you can't access, these kinds of websites and social media. I'm going to try and show the next slide. Yes, okay. So my project, High Peaks for Earth, monitors Tibetan social media in general, and I just thought it would be fun to show some profile pictures of what Tibetan bloggers use to really identify themselves as Tibetans. So you have sort of Tibet written in Tibetan script and in English, but nowhere is it written in Chinese. And even things like the map, it shows the original 3 provinces of Tibet and not the Chinese version of the map, which shows the Tibet Autonomous Region, which is just a very small bit in the middle. So I just thought it's fun to show you how Tibetans sort of identify and assert their identity online. And most people, it's generally known that China has a very sophisticated surveillance system. A lot of online censorship goes on, so it's very risky to share information. And I thought I'd give you some examples of censorship. This writer wrote in Tibetan and shared on a social media platform called WeChat, which is very prevalently used in China, Asia, not so well known in the West, but it's completely sort of Chinese-owned app, and the government has full access. All the servers are in the PRC, so anything that gets shared on WeChat can be tracked down, can be monitored. And when somebody wanted to report the arrest of their friend, a writer Shokjan, on WeChat, we were fortunate to save and screenshot the content of what was shared, but then when you go back 1 or 2 days later, you'll see the warning which says this content was sensitive, politically sensitive, and has now been erased. So you go back to look for something, and it's gone. So that is a big challenge to monitoring internet and social media. And even if you use this app, WeChat, people can have prison sentences just for sharing information, which to us seems quite innocent. There was an online anti-fur campaign because His Holiness the Dalai Lama said to Tibetans, it's not good, we have to respect animals' rights, and we shouldn't use fur, and we shouldn't wear fur. So a lot of fur burning and sort of anti-fur campaign happened. And because it originated from the Dalai Lama, it was immediately shut down as being politically sensitive, and people were given 5-year, 7-year prison sentences for just sharing information about this anti-fur campaign online. There have also been a lot of protests in Tibet against mining. A lot of mining is happening all over Tibetan areas, and so Tibetans are writing poetry and talking about this in a way that they can hopefully bypass the censors. This is one example of a poem that my website translated about mining when there were actually at the time a lot of anti-mining protests going on. And a more recent phenomenon in the last few years have been self-immolation protests by Tibetans. But when you go on the Chinese Twitter, Weibo, and you enter the Chinese term for self-immolation, it turns up no results. So if Tibetans want to talk about politically sensitive terms, but they're not allowed to talk about them, they often end up writing about them in indirect ways and using imagery and using symbols and using language, like more poetic language, like poetry. So this is one example that my website translated, which refers to the self-immolations, but indirectly. One thing that I've noticed over the last few years monitoring blogs is that blog activity has severely reduced inside Tibet, and it's mainly because the main blogs they just don't exist anymore. They've all either been shut down, or people are choosing to self-censor and not bring out information because it's too risky. So this just basically displays that it's very difficult to get information if people are not blogging, if the sites are not functioning. And I just wanted to end with something which I thought was quite inspiring and defiant. It just happened last week. This singer from Tibet spent 4 years in prison for singing songs related to the Dalai Lama and to politics. And he was released last week, and there were pictures circulating of him being welcomed back home by his family and friends, being treated really like a hero. And these pictures were circulating where he's holding this guitar. And the guitar actually says in Tibetan, freedom, equality, and rights. So he's just out of prison for singing these defiant songs, and already he's on his guitar, and he's probably planning some more subversive, dissident type songs, but really expressing his feelings. So I'm just going to leave it for there, and then I'm going to pass over to Kunsang Kelden, who will talk more about cultural expressions relating inside Tibet to outside Tibet. Thank you.
everybody. My name is Kunsang Keldon, and I'm Tibetan and Kalmyk Mongolian, and I'm from New York. But I came here about 2 years ago to do my master's in performance and culture, and I did my dissertation on contemporary Tibetan art and also music. So what I'm going to introduce is my blog project, which is called Lakar Diaries. And it was founded by a group of young Tibetans like myself who wanted to honor the Lakar movement inside of Tibet. What is Lakar? Well, the literal translation means White Wednesday. And inside of Tibet, Tibetans, as you've seen, Ali and Dechen give examples of how, Tibetans are so dedicated to preserving our identity and our culture, and sometimes, almost always inside of Tibet, there are very severe consequences to doing that and taking actions. So the Lakar movement is a little bit, it's still subversive in nature. It's a non-cooperation movement in Tibet where Tibetans chose Wednesday because it's the birthday of the Dalai Lama, our spiritual leader. And basically on this day, Tibetan people inside of Tibet decided to wear Tibetan clothing, speak Tibetan language, visit Tibetan businesses, eat Tibetan food, chat to each other on their phones in Tibetan language, basically doing all the things that you can do personally as an individual to show that you can assert your identity, your Tibetan identity, in a climate where, I'm sure a lot of immigrants who come to the US or come to the UK, and you see how you assimilate so much to Western culture or whatever culture you're in at the time. And in Tibet, it's Chinese culture and it's Chinese language, which is completely dominant. So our way of doing that basically was to have young Tibetan people write about how they're, in their own way, asserting their Tibetan identity. And everyone writes about different topics. They write about history or literature or talks they've been to, or things that they've read about, or basically it's whatever anyone is interested in that has to do with asserting their sense of Tibetan identity. And on that note, these two guys are two Tibetan rappers, young guys from different parts of the world that found each other online, who are showing a really great example, I think, of being inspired by what's happening inside of Tibet, and also showing how you can do it in a way where you don't have to be in the same physical space, in a physical place to work together. And they found each other by watching each other's music videos online. And the guy on the left, Karma Emchi, who goes by the name Shapale, is a Tibetan rapper born in Lhasa, grew up in Lhasa in Tibet, and lives in Switzerland. And the guy on the right is a Tibetan rapper born in Nepal who lives in New York City. And this is a video still of them while they shot Shapale's video called Sampa in New York City a few years ago. And Shapale, which literally it means, I don't know, it's like a meat pastry, basically. Like, it would be like an empanada, or like a little, yeah. Okay. A meat patty, a fried meat patty pastry, and it's a delicious Tibetan treat. And he became famous. He made a viral video about this fried meat pastry, which was really, talked about all over the place. And then his next follow-up video was about Sampa, which is a staple food of the Tibetan diet. And on the bowl on the right is a bowl of that barley flour, and then you mix it with Tibetan butter tea, which is made with tea, butter, and salt, and then you make these little balls and then you eat them. But what I found researching Tibetan musicians outside and inside of Tibet is that there are a lot of common themes in Tibetan music. One of them, for him at least, is food. And other themes are language and a sense of home, a sense of place, usually Tibet, almost always Tibet actually, and a sense of longing, I found. So most Tibetans would identify as Sampa eaters. So in this video, he talks about being a Sampa eater, being a proud nomad, being a proud Tibetan, being proud to have this history and to speak in Tibetan. Chapelet raps only in Tibetan, and his Tibetan is amazing. It's like a level which parents aspire all of their children to reach, which is why he is so appealing to people of all different ages. Young people because he's cool and he's a rapper, and older people because he's an example of someone who has a very high skill of Tibetan language and can reach so many different types of people. Exile Prophet, the other rapper, he mainly raps in English. And his video that I'm going to show is about the Tibetan alphabet. And I know from experience that learning the Tibetan alphabet is not the easiest or the most fun, but when you have a really cool rap song to go along with it, I think it makes it a little bit more interesting than just being in a class. So if we can just play the video from 53 seconds, that would be great. After this commercial.
You
have to play the rest of the video. We could just move on to the next slide. I think I could do that. Yeah. Click. There you go. So that's Chapelet, and there are other folks who are also continuing to do more work with Tibetan hip hop, and some other artists that now have branched out into doing things like clothing brands, which the other rapper Exiled Prophet has gone on to do men's clothing line that basically embodies Tibetan hip hop. So basically these are spaces where people are able to assert their sense of what they think Tibetan identity is about. And Green Dragon, which we'll see that video later on, is a great example of Tibetan rappers inside of Tibet who are so unapologetically here to, say that this is who we are, we're the new generation, we're not sorry for being young, being Tibetan, and I think that they're just a great example of people who are very brave artists in Tibet who continue to produce videos online. This is another example of commentary about Tibetan language and Tibetans' sort of anxiety about the use of Tibetan language. This is by a Tibetan artist in Tibet named Nortse, and who made the 30 consonants cast in iron and let them oxidize so it rusted. And then each consonant has a borderland as a sort of commemoration. And then lastly, there's a Tibetan artist in exile named Tenzing Rigdol, who did a soil project, which was a clandestine operation bringing out 20,000 kilos of Tibetan soil from Tibet, from Shigatse, and smuggling it through Nepal to Dharamsala, India, and made this platform that was raised about my height and spread 43 feet down and 43 feet long ways. And he made this installation, he created a physical space for Tibetan people who've been living in exile to reunite with Tibetan soil. So I think this project was particularly special because all these Tibetan artists are talking about being outside of Tibet, or a lot of the ones that I mentioned anyway, and he's someone who brought Tibet to them. And I think mentally he was able to create a space for Tibetan people to feel as though they were back in Tibet and to feel like united as a community in experiencing what it was like to be back on Tibetan soil. This is a photo of Rigdol presenting his soil to His Holiness, who wrote the Tibetan letters for Tibet in the sand. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. So, as we've heard, Tibet has been occupied for nearly 7 decades now. For the first 40 years of the occupation, there was very, very little international active support. And the Tibet movement as we know it now is virtually non-existent. However, in the late 80s, there was a mass uprising in Lhasa, and during that uprising, where there was a huge amount of bloodshed, there were a number of Western travellers who happened to be in Lhasa, and they witnessed this uprising. And when they came back home to the West, they brought with them the stories of the courageous Tibetans and the bloodshed that they'd seen and the terrible oppression that they'd witnessed Tibetans living under. And this was the start of the Tibet movement. These Westerners reached out to Tibetans that they met in exile and helped to set up Tibet groups to gain some political support and start campaigning to change the situation. And by the end of the 1990s, there were more than 200 Tibet groups around the world in 50 different countries. And you know, they were very spread out, they were very isolated, and often the campaigns that were being run were being not supported as much as they possibly could. So a group of experienced Tibet campaigners got together and devised a plan to build a mechanism that would enable all of these different Tibet groups to work together, to work in more coordination. And voila, International Tibet Network was formed. It was formed in 2000, and the purpose of the network is to work to strengthen this worldwide Tibet movement. So our main aim is that we support groups that support the Tibetan people and their desire for change. And we believe really strongly that it's with a united movement, a united social movement of Tibet groups that is going to challenge China's might and will kind of finally create the change. So our role is to bring together different Tibet campaigners from all around the world. This is people from Europe, Tibet groups from Europe, coming together to talk about strategies on how they can work together, build different campaigns, and we as the network give them as much support as we can. We aim to build their capacity, and we aim to give them as many resources as we can, and we translate our resources into a whole wealth of different languages to try and encourage them to work together as much as possible. But one of our main ambitions is to support international campaigns which are coordinated so that the same messages are being used, are being put forward. And one of our main campaigns is called Free Tibetan Heroes. And the Tibetan Heroes campaign celebrates the courageous, non-violent struggle of the Tibetan people, and particularly individuals who have put their heads above the parapet and they have spoken out and they have said that they're really not happy with the situation and have asked simply for change. And one of the current priority cases in our political prisoners campaign is a young man called Tasi Wangchuk, and I'm going to play a short video of him. If you can start the video from 1 minute 30 and play to 3:40, please.
我叫扎西。关于那么多人去自焚的我现在能理解他们，因为我们真正可以去做这件事情的渠道很少。无论任何人都不想生活在一个压力和恐惧的环境里面。从间接方面的话，它是一种谋杀民族文化的方法。从政治方面来讲的话，一个民族需要消灭一个民族的话，首先需要消灭它的语言和那个文字。我们在那边不敢讨论这些问题，因为现在很多手机和那些都可以监控，而且我们不知道在哪些地方放了一些监控或者监听器，它可以用任何名义来随便逮捕你，而且没有办法去上诉，或者说是因为没有一个完整的法律体系，所以我们没有办法去讨论这些问题。 开始是我哥哥教我的，然后我现在的藏文的写作能力和那个汉语的写作能力，汉语的写作能力已经超过了藏文的写作能力，然后我自己也感觉得到藏文的使用能力和认识理解能力等都在退步。
Thank you. So, Tashi is a young Tibetan businessman, but he's also a language rights activist, and we've heard lots about the importance of the Tibetan language. And Tashi had gone to Beijing to put in an appeal legally within his rights to ask for the Tibetan language to be taught to Tibetans in schools. A very, very simple ask. And this interview you just saw was with the New York Times. And just months after this video was released, Tashi was detained by the Chinese police. And he was disappeared for at least 2 months. And he is now currently awaiting trial on charges of inciting separatism. And that was simply for asking for the Tibetan language to be taught in schools. He could be tried at any moment, literally any moment. And we are very concerned about him. We know that he was tortured or has been tortured whilst he's been detained. And his trial could take place at any moment, and he is, if found guilty, he could be facing a 15-year prison sentence. So, we're obviously campaigning very hard to get him released. We're asking our governments to raise his case as highly as they possibly can to really put pressure on China. So we want to ask, going the wrong way. We want to ask you here if you would sign a petition asking governments to make sure they are calling on China to release him. He has done nothing wrong. He's asked to be able to have his children be taught a language. You know, it's very important that governments do stand up for him. We also have a writing campaign. You know, Amnesty does this type of work all the time, and they feel very strongly that if we can raise the profile of prisoners as highly as possible, that there's more likelihood that they will be released and released safely. So we're asking supporters to write to him in prison. And you can find all of these materials online. We also do have some handouts which we will take and have in the human rights room later. But another way to do this is if you all have a smartphone, you could download a touch note or another postcard type app and send him a postcard. You could send it to the Chinese embassy, say something very simple, just to ensure that China know that he is on our radar and we are watching them to see what happens with his case, and we expect him to be released. Another thing to do is obviously to try and find a Tibet group to join. You know, as I said earlier, you know, we are supporting Tibet groups. We want as many supporters as possible to join groups and take as much action as they possibly can. And it's Tibet groups in your area which will be able to give you the advice and the campaign actions to take part in. So we urge you to find a Tibet group. There are a number in the UK, and there are literally hundreds across the world. So there will be one near you. And the last really key thing to do, a number of people on the stage have spoken about uprising, you know, Tibetan uprising. It has been a huge action which has been taken by brave Tibetans, and we commemorate that every single year. This year it's happening on the actual date, which is the 10th of March. So please, if you're in London, go along to the protest, join the Tibetans who will be out on the street in force, and kind of show your solidarity for us. Also, obviously, we're very proud to have been put on one of the charity pots, and we often get tweets and messages from people who have seen them in shops, so really do try and encourage people to buy them, and buy them for your friends. And lastly, finishing on a horrible photo. Obviously, you know, the world is in a state of flux, and none of us know where we are, and none of us really know what's going on. We obviously imagine that that our governments are still going to feel the wrath of China and aren't going to stand up for the Tibetan people as much as they should be. And we feel really strongly that with the non-violent movement that the Tibetans have kind of put forward for all of these decades, they really deserve our support. And in times like this, when so many crises are seeing people turn to violence to try and find a solution, it's the non-violent movement that really, really needs our support. So we urge you to really stand up and help.
Thank you very much. I think that this morning's programme has overrun a bit. We were going to take questions at this point, but I think we'll be outside. I think if you've got an individual question, come and find us. So from all of us, what we wanted to do was, Declan, why don't you introduce? We'll finish with just a last bit of inspiring music.
Yes. So, like we were saying that, there's so much happening in Tibet, and there are so many things that you could really get quite depressed about. Political prisoners and being imprisoned just for language rights, but we chose today to talk about sort of cultural expressions, because when you really see what's happening inside of Tibet, Tibetan people are so strong in their thinking, and they just have this intense longing for freedom which comes out in all different ways. So we wanted to end on a sort of a more positive note and show you Tibetan rappers from inside Tibet. Just, like Kunsang was saying, we're really bold, really defiant, have this very independent, spirit. And that's really what we're sort of celebrating today. So thank you, Lush. Thank you to the Tibet Network, who've been, staunch supporters for so many years. Thank you for spending your morning with us here at the Lush Summit. And we'll leave you with the video.
Play the video.
Play the video. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a picture selfie.
không xuất hiện trong khi chủ lý mà chủ nhân của hành vi trả lời thành chất và tập xuất hiện vì tôi chưa nấu vì nam cả tí tế sao nên chưa nhớ về là cứ không biết thế Mara sarva, Mara sarva, Mara sarva, Ramo, Devi, Sabti,